How would a post-apocalyptic scavenger navigate through the narrow lanes of a flooded city? Well, this is the Scavenger Cutter. Modular, 3D printed, and ready for a game of Spire Seas. And definitely the most complicated design I've made so far. So, let's see how it's done. The basic idea was to create a relatively small ship that could fit comfortably on the 2-foot by 2-foot game board, which I recommend for Spire Seas, but still managed to carry a crew of 5 miniatures. In the past, I made a catamaran, the Scav Cat, but there were a few things that didn't really work for the new version of the game. One, it's just too big, and also it's not really fully 3D printable. This was mostly scratch built with some 3D printed parts. So I wanted something that people could print at home right out of the box. First, it needs to be the right size. Now I'll explain why in my next video, but for this model, it needs to fit on 2 standard size playing cards, both horizontally and vertically. Second, it needed to be at least somewhat modular, both to easily fit on the bed of a 3D printer and for players to be able to customize their weapon loadouts, possibly even between games. And finally, it needed to feel like it belonged in the Diluvian Age, with that mixture of sci-fi but post-apocalyptic aesthetics. So, with all that in mind, it was time to load up Blender. I started by modeling the base. This is not necessarily what I'm going to be using for the game moving forward, but it does give me important reference for the size of the ship. This rectangle here is exactly the length of 2 standard playing cards laid end to end, which, if you weren't aware, is exactly 7 inches. I also included a copy of my Scav Captain for reference. This is the largest miniature that I've made so far, so if he fits, then everything else will too. And if you haven't seen the process of making him yet, then you can check that out up here. I then got to work on the basic shape of the hull, starting at the waterline and working my way up, while making sure that at least 5 miniatures on 25mm bases could fit comfortably on the deck. Then I went through and blocked out the major features, things like the ram, the mast, and the controls, which would affect the entire shape and structure of the ship. With those in place, I could start to add in a bit more detail, trying to keep a relative balance between the bow and the stern. I'm particularly proud of these pipes and steel drums. There are just few things as good at giving something a sci-fi or post-apocalyptic look. Next, it was time to start implementing one of the modular aspects of this model, the little mount points for the turrets. The plan here was to create little slots on the ship, which I could then later insert these posts into. Once I had a consistent size and setting for all of this, I could duplicate it over the model, and then I would have a consistent place to work for any other turrets. This allows a turret to be moved from front to back, for example, or to any of the other spots. Once those were set up, I could start working on even finer detail, things like the fittings around the edge and the floor plates to break up that open space. And this process basically just continued, adding in finer and finer detail, like sculpting in the grains of the wood on the rim, until I was finally happy with how much I had accomplished so far. The last thing to do for the basic model was to cut the whole thing in half and key in some slots for magnets. This is mostly so that the model will fit on the relatively small size of my 3D printer, and hopefully anyone else's printer who wants to make this for themselves. However, by adding in the magnets, you have the added bonus of a little extra functionality. Who knows, I might even decide to change out the back so that you can have various versions of this even more modular scavenger ship. Now, I was going to stop there. I figured that I had everything I needed to expand on this model in the future. In fact, I even got started painting it. But once I had it on the table in front of me, I knew that something was missing. So I went back to Blender and finished working on those little detail pieces that you see here. In the end, I finished sculpting and modeling two separate turrets, one a more post-apocalyptic harpoon gun, and one a more sci-fi electro cannon thing, and the railings that would support them. Plus, I even sculpted some little basic posts that could be slotted into an empty mount point. Then I got to work on the sail of the ship and a little replacement piece that could go on if you prefer to go without the sail. Finally, I made a tiny little steering wheel for the controls, which helps to make this ship feel just a little more piratey. All of this was super time consuming, and one of the reasons that this video is coming out way later than I expected, but I feel like it's well worth it, making everything really fit together and look like a fully fledged and working vessel. Plus, I will also be adding more little variations in the future, things like some more different weapon mounts, as well as a new centerpiece and possibly new controls. So let me know what you'd like to see down in the comments. But for now, we could call it finished and move on to the painting. With all these little bits finally glued in place, I ended up having to completely restart my paint job, but it's okay, I kind of changed directions anyway. I started with a coat of Mr. Mahogany Surface Primer. This is quickly becoming one of my favorites to use on models because it leaves the crevices with a dark but not just black look to it. This is great if you're going to be painting a lot of dirt and rust, which I am. I then painted up the underside of the hull with a layer of just basic uniform gray. This gives it the look of something that was painted and rugged, not shiny steel any longer. I then moved on to the deck of the ship, which got a coat of darker gray, as well as some splotching of a lighter, browner gray color. This was intended to match the color of my bases, but the splotching didn't quite work out as well as I thought. However, this ended up getting covered up mostly by later steps in the process. I then moved on to some of the smaller bits, giving them a coat of gunmetal metallic. You might be able to see in some of these shots, my original plan was to have these metal parts painted yellow to match the Scav captain's paint job, but in the end I decided against that, keeping this ship more neutral so that any crew I might want to use with it could be represented. Next, I went over the deck of the ship with a nice dry brush, which helped cover up some of that splotchiness, and then got to work on adding some rust. Now for this model, which is a boat sitting in salt water, I went ahead and let myself go a little crazy on the rust, adding a ton of it to the front ram, which would be in direct contact with the water, as well as all of the metal parts getting a healthy dose of that iron oxide. As always, this is the stage where I finally start to feel like I have something that fits into the world that I'm building, which is really great, and probably why I like Rust so much. Finally, I finished painting up my little turrets and the sail as well, which was mostly one color and probably would be done better with an airbrush, but I don't have one yet. However, by adding in a thick layer of nice dark tone wash, that kind of helps to hide the streakiness of this large flat panel. And with that, the Scav Cutter finally looked seaworthy. Let's take a closer look. And there she is. After over a year of learning how to use Blender and print miniatures and paint them, I finally have a full crew of 3D printable miniatures for use in Spire Seas. And if you want to print them out and use them for a game of Spire Seas or some other game, then you can find them on myminifactory.com. Plus, if you get the whole crew together on the Scav crew bundle, you will save about 30% on the minis. I'm really excited to see what people do with them. For example, seeing this Scav veteran, one of my first miniatures ever, painted by Nagling, a member of my Diluvian Chronicles Discord, filled me with so much joy and happiness. I was really excited to see someone else's take on one of my designs. When making these miniatures, I have a very focused view of what they should look like, and that can often stop me from making really interesting decisions. So please, if you get your own versions painted up, then please let me know, either on Diluvian Chronicles Discord or some of my social media. I'm hopefully going to feature them here at the end of my videos from here on out. So thank you. Makes me really happy. Now, for the next few videos, I'm going to be taking a step back from miniatures, now that I have a fully 3D printable crew and ship. And instead, I'll be buckling in on game design. So stick around here on the channel if you'd like to see how that goes. And of course, follow me on social media like Instagram or Twitter, or join me on Diluvian Chronicles Discord if you want to see more up-to-date information. Well, that's all for now, so thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed and maybe even learned something in the process. See you next time.